can still hear it, like it was said just this morning. My son's voice, small but steady, Dad. I don't need a perfect father. I just need you.
Those words broke me open, but they also anchored me in a way I hadn't expected. For months, I had been drowning in silence heavy as the night itself. And in that moment, looking at him, at the way his hand fit inside mine, I knew if I was ever going to survive, I had to tell it all. I had to go back to the beginning, to the night everything changed, because the road back started there. And it started because of him. It started slowly the way storms always do, a small shift in the air, a silence where there used to be laughter, a distance in her eyes that I pretended not to see. For months I told myself it was nothing, just stress, just the weight of work, of life, of parenthood. I convinced myself that every marriage has seasons and this was only a winter we would outlast. But denial doesn't hold forever. The truth came crashing in one night when a neighbor voice hushed, told me what the others already seemed to know. Emily wasn't mine anymore. She had given herself to someone else. Not a stranger, not a man from far away, but her cousin, a man who had sat at our table, eaten our food, raised his glass at our wedding. He had smiled at me, called me brother, while quietly taking everything that mattered most. The world tilted that night, and I became a man living inside humiliation. When I confronted Emily, she didn't deny it. She didn't even try. She just looked at me, her eyes flat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and said, "I don't love you anymore, Adam." There was no rage in her voice, no pleading, no apology, only a quiet indifference that cut deeper than any scream could. I remember standing in the kitchen staring at her, waiting for something more, a tear, a crack in her voice, anything. But she gave me nothing. Humiliation doesn't just sting, it spreads. The next morning I felt it everywhere. At the grocery store, whispers trailed behind me like shadows. Two women by the fruit display paused mid-sentence when I walked past. One glanced, the other looked away, and both lowered their voices. At Matthew's school drop-off, the father who usually joked with me at the curb only nodded stiffly, eyes full of pity. I caught sight of myself reflected in his car window. Shoulders hunched, jaw tight, a man already branded as less. Even at work I felt it. My colleagues never said a word, but I could feel their silence. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Meetings passed in awkward pauses as if my shame was too loud to ignore.
I tried to hold my head high. I tried to walk as if nothing had changed, but inside, everything had.
I remember standing in front of the mirror at night. The same mirror I had used every morning to knot my tie, to shave, to prepare myself for the world. Now it reflected a stranger. The strong, steady man I thought I was gone. What I saw instead was hollow, weary, diminished. Matthew was too young to understand. He still came running to me at the door, arms wide, laughter spilling out like sunlight. He still asked me to push him on the swings, to tuck him in, to read him the book with the silly dog on the last page. Those moments tore at me. Because even as I held him, even as I kissed his forehead, I knew. The foundation beneath his little world was already crumbling. He trusted in something that no longer existed.
And his father was powerless to stop it.
At night, the silence between Emily and me grew heavier. We lay in the same bed, separated by more than distance. Her back turned my hand, hovering inches away, desperate to touch, desperate to feel something, anything. But she would shift, retreat, pull the blanket tighter around her body, as if my touch repelled her.
I stopped talking to my brother, stopped calling my best friend, because to say the words out loud, "My wife betrayed me, my marriage is breaking," would make it real. And I wasn't ready for real.
So I swallowed it whole. Every sharp edge, every bitter taste, I carried it alone. Humiliation, I learned, doesn't just exist in public. It follows you home. It crawls under your skin. It lingers in every corner of your house, in every glance from your child, in every empty conversation with the woman who once vowed to love you. One night after she left claiming she had errands, I wandered into the bathroom. The fluorescent light hummed above me. I looked into the mirror and whispered, "How did it come to this?" The reflection had no answer, only tired eyes, the faint stubble of neglect, and a man unraveling. Humiliation had taken more than my pride. It had taken my identity. I was no longer the husband I thought I was. No longer the man who provided, who protected, who was steady.
I was just Adam, the fool, and I felt myself disappearing. I thought humiliation would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The wound that followed was deeper, slower, more surgical in its cruelty.
It was a Saturday morning that smelled like summer and gas from the lawnmowers down the street. Sunlight came in thin slats through the blinds, painting the kitchen table in bars. Emily sat across from me, hands wrapped around a mug. She stared at the rim, not at me. Her voice was flat when it came. "Adam, I want a divorce." 3 words, simple, final. They dropped into the room like stones into a well. The sound swallowed itself. I tried to stand and my legs felt like someone else's. I begged. I reminded her of vows, of the small rituals that had held us. I talked about Matthew, about continuity, about the life we'd promised to protect. She listened like a person reading a list of ingredients. No surprise, no real weight. When she slid the papers across the table, the stack looked ordinary. Legal paper, neat font boxes to check. Her signature in a practiced hand, calm and spare. My fingers trembled as I picked up the pen. Signing my name felt like erasing myself. Each letter was a small death. The ink dried and with it a chapter closed. Matthew watched from the living room doorway. He had his small dinosaur in one hand, a comic under his arm. He blinked at us the way children do when they sense weather changing. "Is this like in the story, Dad?" he asked, hopeful, naive. No, I lied. It's not like the story. Those moments hurt the worst. Not the arguing, not the betrayal, but the way his little face registered the change. How he tried to fit the new shape of our family into the map he carried in his head. The car left with boxes and a suitcase zipped tight. Matthew pressed his forehead to the window, his breath fogging the glass. He waved. I waved back until my hand went numb. The house hummed after they were gone. Every tick of the clock was a small verdict. I wandered from room to room, touching surfaces like evidence. A towel hung where it always did, a school drawing still taped on the fridge, a sweater on the staircase baluster, abandoned like a flag. The first nights were a type of vertigo. I slept in the bed we shared, but the space felt wrong, too big, too echoing. I'd reach in instinct and find only sheet and cold. I learned the shape of absence by touch. Friends called. I took some calls, avoided others. There were polite phrases, "I'm here if you need anything," that felt like scaffolding without a house. My brother drove down one afternoon, sat with me on the porch, drank black coffee and said nothing for a long time. His silence was heavy with everything he didn't want to fix. Then came the logistics. The lawyer's office smelled like coffee and cheap leather. Paperwork multiplied. We spoke in terms that made my chest ache. Custody, visitation, assets division. Numbers, percentages, dates. I wanted to fight for full custody for an old-fashioned rescue. But I knew the truth. The courts favor stability. And stability for Matthew meant a presence he could count on, not a man, desperate in the night. We arranged a schedule, weekends, alternating holidays, a calendar that felt like a timetable for grief. I memorized every date, inked them into the planner like incantations. There were days I went to pick him up, and he bounded into my arms as if the months had been a blink. Those afternoons were small islands of sunrise. We went to the park. We built forts out of blankets. We made pancakes, lopsided and sweet. Those times stitched me back for a little while. Other visits were harder. He'd sit between us on the couch looking from one parent to the other like a judge who didn't want the responsibility. Emily and I would speak in the language of logistics school pickups, deadlines, dentist appointments, because emotion felt combustible dangerous. We learned to be civil. Polite armor replaced intimacy. Sometimes at night, I would walk the neighborhood. I pretended there were errands to run. In truth, I needed to move. Sitting still made the house fill with ghosts. Walking kept me from listening. At the office, I tried to act normal. I kept my calendar filled, my voice steady. But there were cracks. I missed deadlines, lost momentum on projects. My boss mentioned it once. "Adam, you need to be present." He meant at work. I heard something larger, an accusation, be present in life. There was a stack of dishes in the sink that refused to be my responsibility alone. Laundry ballooned into a chore that overwhelmed the machine. I learned to do things I had once outsourced: fold, iron, fix leaky faucets. They were mundane tasks, but each one was a small anchor. Completing a load of laundry felt absurdly like winning a battle.
Anger came in waves. It would rise hot and volcanic, then sink into cold resignation. Some evenings I found myself standing in the doorway of Emily's car, watching her back recede down the street, and all I could do was whisper into the dark, "How did we get here?" No answer came.
There were moments of strange, almost comical normalcy. I'd show up to parent-teacher conferences and sit across from chairs filled with other parents' steady faces. They'd talk about math homework, about field trips, and I would nod along, grateful for the simple scripts that still existed. Time, merciless steady, continued. Birthdays came and went. Matthew's 8-year-old candles were blown out at a small party in his mother's living room, and I watched from the corner, clapping, pretending not to flinch at the sight of him with other faces around him. When he ran to me with frosting on his cheek, I wiped it with the gentleness of someone praying. The real damage was quieter. It was the small freezes, the hesitation when I wanted to reach for him. The guilt that followed laughter, guilt that I could laugh when part of my world had cracked. The nights I would wake, heart pounding from dreams in which I had failed him. And yet, even in the fracture, there were edges that caught light. On weekday afternoons, when it was just us, Matthew and I created rituals. A silly handshake at the door. A Friday night ritual of microwaved pizza and an old movie. Moments that said, without grand speech, we are still a family in ways that mattered. Separation taught me the language of compromise. It taught me how to make peace with schedules and silence. It taught me the fierce particular love that hunger and distance can sharpen. But it also taught me something harder. That love alone sometimes isn't enough to keep a house standing. That sometimes two people can love a child fiercely and still grow apart as caretakers of different hearts. I learned painfully how to be both a parent and the patient man who had to let go. I learned to show up on the appointed days, to be fully there, to be steady even when my own world felt unsteady. And slowly, in the quiet between pickups and returns, I began to find a new rhythm. Not the one I had planned. Not the neat life I had imagined. But a life with small certainties: dinner at 7, a baseball game on Saturday, a bedtime story on alternating nights. The house was different now, but it still held laughter, sometimes faint, sometimes loud, The echoes of the life we'd built were still there waiting for new work to be done. Separation did not heal me. It broke me in different ways. It forced me to learn how to be present for a boy who needed a father more than he needed perfection. And in that learning, I began very slowly to reassemble myself. After the papers were signed, life didn't explode all at once. It unraveled quietly, thread by thread. What followed was less a catastrophe and more a slow surrender. At work, I tried to hold the line. My desk became a refuge and a trap. I sat in meetings, nodded when expected, typed answers into emails, and then watched my own sentences blur into something I barely recognized. The project I had poured myself into for months, the one with the tight deadlines and the big promises, slipped through my fingers. There were meetings about resource allocation, about focus, about priorities. My name was on the roster one day, replaced the next. They said it was nothing personal. They said they needed someone reliable. The word stabbed like a file. I walked through the office like a ghost, watching teams move in coordinated patterns, listening to laughter that felt distant. People who had once asked about my weekend now asked nothing, as if to avoid prying or embarrassment. It felt like being erased, not with malice, but with an embarrassed politeness that cut just the same. The money tightened. Sudden changes at work meant fewer bonuses, smaller raises, harder choices. Bills that had once been background noise became loud and precise. Credit cards collected dust and then interest. I learned the vocabulary of austerity coupons, price comparisons, stretching meals into one more serving. At home, the small routines that had once defined me collapsed. I stopped buying fresh fruit. Trash sat longer at the curb. I left dishes in the sink as if the sight of them was too much to bear.
I drank more than I should have. A glass to steady the evening turned into a bottle to blur it. I told myself it helped me sleep. It helped me forget. For a while it did both. The relief was brief and expensive.
Sleep was fickle. Sometimes I slept like a stone, heavy and untroubled. Other nights I woke a dozen times, heart racing, mind-running old footage of the house of Emily's eyes, of Matthew's small hand pressed to the glass as the car pulled away. The days folded into a sameness I hated. I missed calls, missed dinners with friends who stopped inviting me, missed birthdays. I let small tasks slide until they snowballed into immobility. The leak under the sink grew into a problem I paid lip service to, then ignored, until the cabinet warped. There were mornings I woke with a concrete dread, a knowledge that I had to go out into the world and pretend the hole inside me was a nothing. I brushed my teeth, put on a shirt, walked to the car, and in the rearview mirror I practiced a smile that felt like a costume. At the worst moments I thought about not coming back. Driving late on empty highways, the streetlights a parade of indifferent stars, I would imagine, continuing letting the road carry me somewhere with no address. Sometimes the thought was an ache that softened the edges of the day. Sometimes it was a terror that made me pull into a rest stop and sit with my hands on the steering wheel until the sun came up. I don't tell you this for shock. I tell you because it's the truth of the fall. Not a single catastrophic event, but 1,000 small surrenders. There were nights when I stood in Matthew's doorway and listened to him breathe, and I wept quietly so he wouldn't hear. I promised myself I would stop, that I would be better the next day. And sometimes I was. But habit is a river that finds its level. Old impulses returned.
A man I had respected called one afternoon. Pete from college, a friend who had weathered things with me. He asked, "You okay, man?" I lied, of course. If you tell the truth, you invite questions you don't have the strength to answer. So I said, "Fine, busy." He didn't press. He never pressed.
Art, which had once been a small sanctuary, became another place I neglected. My paints dried in tubes, The canvases leaned in a corner waiting for a hand that didn't come. Creating had felt like prayer then, like an indulgence. I missed the quiet discipline that used to hold me. There were moments of shame that felt almost theatrical. At a company event, someone made a joke about life changes, and the laughter felt like an audience that knew more than I did. I left early, stumbling out into the night, hands shoved deep into my pockets, pretending the cool air could harden me into composure. And yet among the rot, there were sparks. A late afternoon, when Matthew climbed into the passenger seat, messy hair and bright eyes, and said, "Want to go for ice cream?" Simple words, simple plans, but they landed like a buoy. We drove to the shop, ate cones that made our faces sticky, and for a few hours the world was ordinary again. Those small, ordinary hours were a cruel kindness. They reminded me of what I was risking with each careless night. They taught me that surrender was not inevitable. They made me see in small flashes the possible outline of a life I could still claim. I started to schedule my days in tiny ways: a run on Tuesday mornings, laundry on Wednesday, painting for an hour on Sunday. It wasn't heroic, it was a scaffold. The scaffolding felt inelegant, but it kept me from falling completely. Work responded slowly. I apologized in meetings, I asked questions again, I let other people speak, and then I listened. It wasn't immediate redemption, but a few projects started to come back to me. People noticed the difference, not the old sharpness, but a steadier rhythm. One night, after a drink that tasted like regret, I found an old sketchbook in the back of a closet, pages full of careless lines of faces I had once drawn without thinking. I opened it, and there, in the margin of a page, was a note I had written years before. "Keep going." I laughed, a quiet thing, half at the absurdity, half at the mercy of memory. The downfall is not a single cliff. It is a valley you walk through with slopes and flatlands and weather that changes without warning. I learned that falling doesn't have to be the end. You can stumble and still stand. You can lose the work of years and painfully build again. But it took time. It took small acts. It took moments of humiliation and of courage in equal measure. And always it took the thought of Matthew, his small voice, his hand in mine, as the tether that kept me from slipping into the deep. It was a grey Sunday, the kind that presses down on your shoulders. Rain had started early and hadn't let up. The streets shimmered, the gutters overflowed, the whole town smelled of wet asphalt and loss. I hadn't planned to see Matthew that day. It wasn't my weekend, but the phone rang around noon. Emily's voice was clipped. "Adam, can you take him for a few hours? I've got errands." I said yes before she finished the sentence. Anything, any scrap of time with him I would take. When I pulled up, Matthew was waiting by the door. Backpack on jacket, half-zipped hair sticking out in every direction. He waved the moment he saw me, his grin cutting straight through the rain. "Dad," that single word filled with joy, struck me harder than any insult ever had. He climbed into the car, his shoes squeaking against the mat, and within minutes the silence that had haunted me all week was gone. He talked about soccer practice, about a book he was reading about the kid in his class who had swallowed a marble and had to go to the nurse.
I drove with one hand on the wheel, one ear on his voice, and for the first time in weeks, I felt alive.
At home, I made grilled cheese, nothing fancy, just butter bread and melted slices that stuck to the plate. He devoured 2 sandwiches, his face shining with crumbs. We played cards. He beat me 3 times in a row, and he laughed like victory was the best sound in the world. But when the laughter faded, when the rain softened against the windows, he grew quiet. He looked at me, really looked in that way children sometimes do, as if they see deeper than they should.
"Dad," he said slowly, "why are you always sad now?"
The words stopped me. I tried to laugh it off, tried to change the subject, but he kept staring, his small hands fiddling with the deck of cards. "You don't tell jokes anymore," he added. "And sometimes You look like you're not here, even when you are.
I swallowed hard, my throat thick. What could I say? That his father had broken, that his father had drowned in shame and failure, that some nights I wondered if he'd be better off without me. No, I couldn't give him that.
So I did what I hadn't done in months. I told the truth, or at least part of it. Buddy, I whispered, Dad's been going through something hard, but I'm trying. I really am. He leaned closer, his eyes wide, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't stop trying, Dad. 4 words, small, simple, but they hit me like lightning.
Don't stop trying.
I don't think he knew what he had given me in that moment. A lifeline, a command, a reason to stand when all I wanted was to collapse. He climbed into my lap, small arms wrapping around my neck, his warmth, his trust, his unshakable love. It broke something open in me. Tears spilled before I could stop them. He didn't flinch, he just held tighter. We sat like that for a long time, the rain tapping gently at the windows, the house filled with nothing but our breathing. Later I walked him back to Emily's. He skipped along beside me, splashing in puddles, his laughter carrying through the damp air. I carried his backpack, and I carried his words. At the door, Emily glanced at me, eyebrows raised. "You okay?" she asked, suspicion edging her voice. I nodded. I will be. Because something had shifted. Not in the world outside, not in the divorce papers, not in the whispers of neighbors or the silence of colleagues, but inside me. Where despair had rooted deep, a seed of something else had been planted. Matthew had given me a gift no adult could. Not advice, not strategy, not pity, but belief. Don't stop trying. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the house went quiet. No bottle of whiskey. No television murmuring in the background. Just me, a notebook, and those 4 words written over and over until the page filled. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a clear vision of how to fix everything, but I had something I hadn't felt in months. A reason. The downfall had taken my pride, my marriage, my career, stability, but my son, my boy, had handed me back my fight. And as I closed the notebook, as I turned off the light, I whispered to myself, I won't stop. Not now, not ever. The morning after Matthew's words, I woke different, not healed, not whole, but restless. His voice echoed in my head over and over, don't stop trying, Dad. It became a drumbeat, a command I couldn't ignore. So I began, not with grand gestures, but with the smallest of things. I cleaned the kitchen. The sink, clogged with days of neglect, sparkled under hot water and soap. I scrubbed the counters until the sponge wore thin. It sounds ridiculous, maybe. But when the room was finally quiet and orderly, I stood there and felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Control. The next morning I ran, only a mile. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, and I hated every second. But when I came back drenched in sweat, I felt alive, exhausted, but alive. I started writing lists. Not the endless, ambitious ones I used to abandon after a day. Small ones: do laundry, cook dinner, call Matthew. Each check mark was a victory, each crossed-out task a piece of scaffolding around the ruins of my life. I stopped drinking too. The first week was brutal. Nights stretched like deserts, my body twitching for relief. I lay awake, gripping the sheets, telling myself, not tonight, not this time. When the sun finally rose, I felt like I had fought a war, but I had won. And one victory became 2. 2 became a week. A week became a month. At work, I showed up early, not to impress anyone, not to perform, but because I needed structure. I took the assignments nobody wanted, the tedious reports, the projects others avoided. Slowly my boss noticed, then my colleagues did. The word reliable, once a knife, started to become a rope pulling me back. Matthew noticed too. The next time he visited, he pointed at the fridge where I had taped his drawings neat and centered. Mum doesn't hang them straight, he said, with a grin. I laughed, ruffled his hair, and told him, well, I do. That small pride in his eyes, it fed me more than any promotion ever could. We built new rituals. Every Friday became pizza night, but not delivery homemade. We mixed dough spread sauce, sprinkled cheese. He made a mess. I pretended to be annoyed, and together we laughed until our stomachs hurt. I found my sketchbook again, the one I had abandoned in the downfall. This time, I didn't draw faces of strangers. I drew Matthew, playing soccer, laughing at the table, sleeping on the couch with his toy dinosaur tucked under his arm. Each page became proof that life was still moving, that beauty still existed in the ordinary. Emily noticed the change. She came by one afternoon to drop Matthew off, and her eyes swept the room. The house was clean. The shelves were ordered. The smell of fresh bread lingered in the air. "You've been busy?" she said, almost surprised.
"Trying," I answered simply.
She nodded. No judgment, no mockery, just acknowledgement.
And in that moment I realized something. I wasn't rebuilding for her. Not for the neighbors, not for colleagues, not for pity. I was rebuilding for me. And for Matthew.
The hardest part was patience. There were days I slipped when the weight of loneliness dragged me down. When I stared at the phone, tempted to call Emily, tempted to beg again. But instead I remembered Matthew's words. I picked up a broom or laced my shoes or opened my sketchbook. One action at a time. That was the rule. Slowly, life shifted. The whispers at the grocery store faded. The nods at school pickup grew warmer. Even my brother, who had kept his distance, clapped me on the back one evening and said, "Proud of you, man. It wasn't a grand speech, but it meant the world." One Sunday, Matthew and I built a treehouse in the backyard. It was crooked, uneven, barely safe. But when he climbed up, waving from the window we'd cut out of plywood, his joy filled the air like music. I stood below, hammer still in hand, and realized I was building more than a treehouse. I was building myself again. At work, promotions weren't immediate, but stability was. I was no longer the man colleagues pitied. I was the man they could count on. And quietly, steadily, I started to respect myself again. The loneliness didn't vanish. Nights were still long, but they were no longer filled with despair. They were filled with purpose meals prepped for Matthew's sketches, half-finished books I hadn't read before. And one evening, as I sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee instead of whiskey, I thought, maybe this is what rebuilding looks like. Not fireworks, not applause, just steady, quiet, imperfect progress. It wasn't the life I had imagined years ago when Emily and I first stood at the altar, but it was a life. And for the first time in a long time, it was mine. Healing didn't arrive like lightning. It came in slow drops like rain softening dry earth. And at first, I didn't even notice it happening. It began with Matthew. Of course it did. He was the glue in every broken seam, the light in every shadow. One evening, as we cleared the table after pizza night, he looked at me with that curious tilt of his head. "Dad, can Mom come next time?" The question froze me. I set the plate down carefully as if sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace I'd built. I wanted to say no, to protect myself, to protect him. But his eyes were hopeful, expectant, filled with a child's stubborn belief that broken things could be fixed.
"We'll see," I whispered. It was all I could manage.
That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing his question echo. Could I really sit at a table with Emily again? Could I face the woman who had betrayed me, who had watched me collapse, who had walked away without a backward glance? For weeks the thought gnawed at me, but slowly Matthew's persistence wore me down. He brought her up in little ways. Mom likes pepperoni. Mom always cuts the pizza into squares. It wasn't manipulation, it was longing. He wanted both of us. So I picked up the phone. The call was awkward, stilted. Emily's voice carried hesitation. But when I asked if she'd like to come for dinner, she surprised me. She said yes. That Saturday I cooked like a man preparing for battle. Not with weapons, but with garlic, olive oil, fresh basil. The house smelled of effort, of care, of nerves. When she arrived, Matthew flew to the door, grinning wide. I followed slower, my heart pounding. She stepped inside, cautious, her eyes scanning the room. It had been months since she'd stood in that kitchen.
"Smells good," she said softly. Her voice didn't hold mockery. It didn't hold apology either. Just normalcy.
Dinner was awkward at first. Polite words, careful movements, long silences. But Matthew filled the gaps, talking about school, about friends, about a science experiment with vinegar and baking soda that had gone wrong. His laughter tugged us forward like a rope, pulling two stubborn boats into the same current. And then something small happened. Emily laughed, not forced, not sharp. Just a simple, genuine laugh at one of Matthew's ridiculous jokes. And in that sound I felt a piece of ice inside me crack. Over the weeks it became a pattern, not every night, not every week. But sometimes Emily joined us. We talked more, we fought less. We listened cautiously, like people relearning a language they had forgotten. There were still walls. I didn't trust easily. She didn't open easily. But little by little the walls lowered. One evening after Matthew had gone to bed, we sat in the living room, silence thick between us. Emily stared at her hands. Finally, she whispered, "I was wrong, Adam. I was selfish. I hurt you." The words hit like a punch. I had dreamed of hearing them. I had cursed her for withholding them. And now when they came, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw every ounce of pain back in her face. But another part, the part that had been softened by Matthew, by rebuilding, by the quiet victories of survival, knew screaming wouldn't heal anything. So instead I said, "Yeah, you did," then after a long breath, "But I'm still here." She nodded, tears in her eyes. For the first time in years, I saw the woman I had once loved. Not the betrayer, not the stranger, but Emily. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't erase the past. It didn't magically rebuild trust overnight. But it opened the door. And for the first time I stepped through without fear. The change showed in Matthew first. He glowed. He bounced between us with ease, no longer measuring our silence, no longer bracing for tension. He felt safe, and if nothing else, that was enough. But something else happened quietly in the background. I began to feel lighter. The bitterness that had weighed on me, the constant anger, the endless loop of betrayal, it started to lose its grip. Not because Emily deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. I stopped rehearsing old arguments in my head. I stopped scanning her face for lies. Instead, I focused on the present moment. Her smile at the dinner table, her laugh when Matthew spilled juice, the way her hand brushed mine briefly as we both reached for the salt. They were small things, but small things build bridges. One night I walked into Matthew's room to check on him. He was asleep, his toy dinosaur tucked under his arm. On the nightstand was a drawing he had made. 3 stick figures, me, him, and Emily, all holding hands, all smiling. I stared at it for a long time, my throat tight, my chest heavy, with something I hadn't dared feel in years. Hope, healing wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a choice I made every day. To breathe instead of rage, to listen instead of accuse, to step forward even when the past pulled me back.
And slowly, step by step, I began to believe. Maybe we could be a family again.
The first time we sat at the same table again, It didn't feel like a miracle. It felt fragile, like a bird landing on your hand. One wrong move and it would fly away. It was Matthew's idea, of course. He had been dropping hints for weeks. Mum should come for dinner. Dad, you could make chicken. Mum likes chicken. He never pushed. He just kept planting the seed. And eventually I said yes. That Saturday I cooked. Nothing extravagant. Just roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. Simple food, the kind we used to eat before everything cracked. The smell filled the house, and for the first time in years, the kitchen felt alive. I set 3 plates, 3 forks, 3 glasses. A family table rebuilt out of habit and hope. When the doorbell rang, my hands shook. I opened the door. Emily stood there, Matthew at her side. He bounced in place, excitement spilling from him like sunlight. She stood quieter, eyes uncertain, a half smile caught on her lips.
"Smells good," she said softly. It wasn't much, but it was something.
We sat down. At first it was awkward, forks scraping, glasses clinking, silence filling the gaps. But then Matthew started talking. He told a story about soccer practice, about a goal that wasn't really a goal, but the coach counted it anyway. His hands flew through the air, his laughter bubbling, and slowly the silence broke. Emily asked about my work. I told her about a project. She nodded, listened, even asked a question. I asked about her job. She talked hesitantly at first, then steadier. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fireworks. It was normal. And normal after everything felt extraordinary. Halfway through dinner, Matthew dropped his fork. It clattered on the plate, loud in the quiet. He laughed, a wild, unrestrained laugh. I laughed too. And then, to my surprise, Emily joined in. That sound, the 3 of us laughing together, was something I thought I'd never hear again. It filled the room, warm, steady, real. After dinner we didn't rush. We lingered, sipping coffee, talking about small things. Matthew leaned against me, then against Emily, stitching us together with his small body. When it was time for them to leave, he hugged me tight. "Dad," he whispered, "can we do this every week?" I kissed his forehead. "Yes, buddy, every week." Emily and I stood at the door. Neither of us spoke at first. The weight of everything unsaid hung between us. Then she looked at me, her eyes softer than I'd seen in years. "Thank you, Adam," she said quietly. "For tonight." I nodded. "Thank you too." When the door closed, the house was quiet again. But it wasn't the heavy silence of loss anymore. It was gentle, hopeful. Over the weeks, we repeated it. Dinner here, dinner there, sometimes awkward, sometimes easy, always worth it. The past didn't vanish. The betrayal didn't disappear. But something stronger began to grow in its place. Respect, patience, forgiveness, not instant, not complete, but real. One evening, months later, I stood at the sink washing dishes. Matthew was in the living room working on homework. Emily sat beside him pointing out answers, her voice calm, steady. I looked at them through the kitchen doorway, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace.
Not perfection, not the fantasy of the life we once imagined, but peace.
We were different now, older, marked by scars we couldn't erase, but scars are not signs of weakness. They are proof of survival. I dried my hands, walked into the living room and sat beside them. Matthew looked up, smiling. Emily glanced at me, her eyes meeting mine without flinching. We weren't the same family we once were. We were something new. Something imperfect, fragile, but strong in ways that only broken things can be. And as I sat there, surrounded by the quiet sounds of pencils, scratching of pages, turning of life, continuing, I realized something. Love doesn't erase the past. It teaches you to live with it. It teaches you to build again, not in spite of the scars, but because of them.
And that was enough.